Guruve Gaurachandra Radhikaya Tadare Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tad Bhaktaya Namo Namaha Vancha Kalpatrubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Bhaivacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Dhanyavad Pranam devotees. So this short video is in relation to a class that I gave on Sunday on our regular Zoom session. And at the same time, it answers a couple of questions that were a little bit older, actually. These were questions that came in a little bit after I returned from travel. And they dealt with sort of interactions between devotees. They dealt with the various problems that devotees have when they take to the practice of bhakti. One devotee mentioned that it was a husband and wife, actually, and they mentioned, the wife did, that after initiation, she seemed to encounter more problems than she did solutions to problems. And she was speaking that was initially. She said things have obviously rounded out or gotten better, but that they faced many challenges. She mentioned even that there were challenges in the marital relationship by the different, speeds at which they were unfolding in the process. So I just want to speak a little bit about the psychology, which is what the title is here. I gave a whole class on this on Sunday, but here I'm just doing something very brief. The psychology of the aspirant in the practice of bhakti. I've often spoke, even from many, many years ago, that actually when I was graduating high school, I was going to go to college. I was undetermined about what I wanted to study, and somehow or another at that time, just false ego and other social status things said, oh, we should do pre-med or something. But obviously I didn't really have an interest in medicine. It was just simply a social phenomenon, among my peers, who's going to do what and what's prestigious and what's not. But anyway, in the course of being more realistic about what I wanted to study, I looked at psychology and sociology and the human sciences. And by that time, I had already had an introduction to yoga and to bhakti and so forth. Not so deeply, but I had an introduction. And one of the things that I certainly understood was that any of the social sciences or human sciences, there has to be an inadequacy in the overall depth of the human sciences and social sciences, because it's not possible to really give a full, holistic picture of the human condition without understanding the essence of the human condition, which is the soul. So that was a very big turning point for me in even looking at an academic pursuit, because I thought, wow, how could it be that something which purports to be an answer to many of the psychological, emotional, and other human experiences to deal with issues that arise within it, how could that be if the very essence of the human being, which is the soul, is not something that's front and center? So I brought that up because when devotees take to the path of bhakti, also there is a sense of psychological adjustments and emotional adjustments that go on. And in many cases, devotees are unable to synthesize what's in the practice and the various emotional and psychological adjustments that are going on. And therefore they feel that there's a need to look towards the social sciences for some answers to some of these things, because they have not seen where it might be in the canon of our theology. So a couple of things here. One is that part of the issue is that there's a lack of familiarity with the expanse of Gaudiya theology. And we should, but don't always, have the appreciation that Bhakti is absolute. And absolute means it must also be inclusive, absolutely, of everything that would pertain to the soul and the karmic experience, and hence sometimes coined our human experience, right? Everything must be there in relation to that. But to fast forward here, because we're trying to make this short, in the writing of Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur Pad, in one book he has written called Madhurya Kandambini. In this book, it most excellently addresses the psychological component in a Vaishnav Siddhantic way. It addresses the psychology of an aspirant through the stages of unfoldment in Bhakti. He identifies the various unfolding stages from Ado Shraddha to Sadhu Sangha, Bhajana Kriya, Anartha Nivritti, which is a big phase in the psychological adjustments that go on, Nishta, and then spiritual taste, Ruchi, and then deep spiritual attachment, which is foundationed on realization, called Ashakti, and then the actual synthesis or complete attainment of oneness with the spiritual energy by the soul, and therefore self-realization in the form of bhav. So the stages that we go through often produce various levels of psychological adjustment, because we have been able to, within our material context, always frame everything out. For instance, I will know that if I'm taking a pursuit in any given field, there is a marker of beginning, there's a sort of step-by-step marker along the way of where I am, and then I also have an end goal in mind. And when I start the endeavor, 9 out of 10 times, there's also a time frame given. If I'm going for a 4-year degree, it's exactly that. It's a 4-year degree. So minus whatever adjustments may be made in my more diligent pursuit or less diligent pursuit, it may lengthen that, but I have a framework. So even in the same way regarding, savings account or doing a budget, I know that if I'm going to put this much money away and do this and do that, then by this period of time I should have accumulated this, and so forth and so on. So we operate in that paradigm that everything has a framework, and that framework is marked, especially by time markers and so forth. So it makes everything seem easy within the purview of our doership. And what I mean by that is that we have the feeling that I'm doing this. And therefore, if I can set up this very clear framework, I can feel my sense of doership taking effect. But here's where the first big psychological adjustment in Bhakti comes, and that's that we are not the doer. That only Bhakti is based on the desire of a jiva to take on a mood of service towards Bhagavan. That desire then requires mercy or kripa. And that mercy and the dispensing of that mercy is not in our control. So one of the first areas of extreme psychological vulnerability is the realization, I'm not the controller. I'm not the doer. I'm absolutely and completely dependent on Bhagavan. I'm absolutely and completely dependent on Sri Guru and the mercy of Sri Guru in order to move forward in this process. And therefore the doorway and one of the first angas of Bhakti, or Saranagati, speaks to that. That the very first thing I have to realize is all of my endeavors, anukulyasya sankalpa, pratikulyasya vivarjanam. The perspective I take on what's good and what's bad is no longer in relation to me, but it's in relation to Krishna. Rakshashiti vishwas goptrave varanam tata. That now I have to have a vishwas. Literally, vishwas is a very interesting word. It's composed of two things in Sanskrit, V and Shwash. And one meaning of Shwash is to breathe. So here the meaning is the same kind of faith, trust, or confidence you put in the Lord to breathe from second to second is the kind of faith that's needed to realize God. Think about that. The same faith you put that I will take the next breath because it's completely out of your control. That same sort of dependence. I am depending on God, Rakshishiti, that fully He's protecting. And a lot of times devotees translate this as protecting the physical body and so forth, so on. But really the implication here is protecting my pursuit of self-realization and service to you. You can protect me from all obstacles in regard to that. And you can maintain. Goptrave Varanam Tata doesn't mean just maintaining my house, family. If I'm brahmachari, maintaining my brahmacharya and my ability to function in society. Here, Goptrave Varanam Tata means, oh, Krishna is my maintainer in a sense that it is Krishna through Guru Parampara and eventually Guru who's subsidizing the power to perform bhakti. Because Atahashi Krishna Namadi Nabhavat Grayam Indriya. The material senses have no capacity to perform bhakti. You cannot see with your eyes darshan of Thakurji. You cannot chant with your own tongue the Hare Krishna Mahamantra. It requires the subsidy coming from the Kripa of Guru to make suitable your eyes to have the ability to see through the vision of Guru's Kripa what is darshan of Bhagavan. It is the subsidy of Guru that allows your tongue to reproduce the Shabda Brahman or Shabda Murti, more accurately, of Shri Krishna. And it is through the hearing of Srimad Bhagavatam from Shri Guru and high class of sadhus that Shruta Ikshita Panta, on the path of this kind of hearing, that you will develop the ability to genuinely realize who am I, who is Bhagavan, what is our relation, etc., etc. So this Shruta Ikshita, seeing through hearing, this is all part of the subsidy given by Bhagavan in Parampara, but given directly through Shri Guru. So it means we no longer have the individual sense of doership, and that is an extremely psychologically vulnerable place. And therefore, there's a sense on how much of that can I hold on to. All right, I'm willing to give something. I understand we have to do Saranagati. So I'm surrendered. I believe in Krishna. I've taken initiation. I'm following the principles, everything. So listen, what more do you want from me? Right? Sometimes, and I'm being facetious here, but sometimes subtly that becomes a mentality that, okay, I've given. What do you want? Right? But of course we know that the very nature of the relationship with Krishna is described in pure bhakti. Anya abhilas sunya. Right? The suffix ita is added to the phrase anya abhilasita sunya. But here the idea is anya abhilas sunya. So no other desire except anukulin Krishna nusilanam. That all endeavors, sil dhatu, in the word silanam means endeavors, right? Of the body, the mind, and spiritual moods, everything should only be for Krishna's anukul. So it doesn't leave any perspective for my self-interest. And I've spoken on this just unlimitedly for my own edification as well, over these past months, weeks, and so forth, right? That no room for self-interest whatsoever. That again creates such a vulnerability in the psyche. That nothing for me, everything for Bhagavan, Hari Guru Vaishnava, I have no control over it either, right? It just makes us so vulnerable that now, because we've not experienced necessarily that, I'm phrasing this in a way to make the philosophical presentation more clear. Because obviously people have practiced bhakti in a previous life perhaps, therefore it's not the first experience. But I'm speaking of it in that context just to give an idea or more clarity around the concept overall. So, the idea that I've not experienced that before, that for the first time in my life I'm experiencing an absolute idea of I don't have control. I'm completely vulnerable in that sense. And there's not even a prospect for reacquiring self-control, because everything that is acquired is to be used in the service of Krishna. So this is a complete state of psychological vulnerability. And because of that, Haribol Sadan Siddha Prabhu, Dandavat Prem Didi also. So this is a really vulnerable state. So naturally, there'll be times in the beginning stages of bhakti, which are called anishtita bhakti. The word nishta means, what is it? Nishta nischalaya yasha iti nishta. One description is given of nishta. It means nischal, means there's no movement or fluctuation or oscillation of the consciousness between material and spiritual. Because through the beginning of bhakti, that vacillation between being spiritual and trying to deal with the material world, that's a constant thing. So the stage of nishta means when that has subsided and there's a dominance of the influence of the spiritual energy, and therefore one's consciousness becomes more placid, more calm, and is more able to digest the spiritual energy, and that gives rise to experiencing what is called ruchi, the stage called ruchi. So in this earlier stage of anishtita bhakti, which means bhakti that's not steady like that, there are 6 different stages. One stage is called utsamai. So utsamai has been translated as false enthusiasm. I don't really like to use the word false enthusiasm, but it is truly probably the easiest and most available English translation of utsav mai. Utsav means enthusiasm. Mai here means that's not substantive. In other words, it's come about through mostly material experience. For instance, the first time that you may go to visit a temple, and when you go to the temple, the atmosphere is very peaceful, the cultural attraction, perhaps if you're not from India or something, and the cultural attraction of the deities, the colors, the beauty of their dress, the incense in the air, and then of course you experience the devotees if they're proper devotees and they're very kind, very soft-hearted, and then prasad is served, it is very good, and then the atmosphere overall is pleasing to the senses, and the dominant feature of your experience is how it was pleasing to you. There is no substantive idea yet or any philosophical basis or foundation of how it's pleasing to Krishna. So in the very beginning, the thrust of enthusiasm for going to the temple, being around the devotees, is the pleasure that it gives to the aspirant, right? Now, because that pleasure, like any pleasure in the material world, is temporary. And what I mean by temporary here is that it's not truly pleasure of bhakti, because the dominant feature of it is related to ourselves. Like Atma Indriya Priti Tare Bhale Kam in Chaitanya Charitamrita. Atma Indriya Priti Tare Bhale Kam. So the kind of self-pleasure in any context that's based around us, our self-interest, our happiness, it is still called kam. Kam here means self-interest. You understand? My happiness. So it is not that my experiences at the temple in the very beginning and the enthusiasm around it is born from so much deep realization about a desire to serve Krishna, as much as it's very resonating with my happiness. This is a peaceful place, nice prasadam, nice devotees, even the music is nice. You understand? So therefore, this first stage of enthusiasm is called utsamai, or like a false enthusiasm, because it is not foundation. I've given the example on the class that I had Sunday. If you get one of the kind of things that you have to buy from a store and put together yourself. So there's usually 2 phases of this. One is the instructions, which many people toss away because they're always so complicated. All right, some people live by them. My wife lives by, give me the instructions, and she puts things together. All right, for some people, they'll just figure it out. But in either case, there's one phase where you may put the structure together, but you've not added the glue or the nails or screws, which are the binding elements of that structure. So in the same way, when we come into bhakti in the beginning, there's just an overarching kind of structure we've imagined in our mind from based on what we've heard and could digest about what we believe bhakti to be. Still, because there's not enough theological, philosophical depth to that, it doesn't serve as an adhesive to that structure. And therefore, as soon as there's any realization that this is not going to happen within a week, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, or 2 lifetimes, then the enthusiasm about it tends to wane. And the approach then to bhakti becomes mixed. It is called Ganatarala. Ganatarala means hot and cold, right? So it means that that initial enthusiasm was produced by something, which was Ado Shraddha, the spark of faith, which gave rise to consideration of looking at life beyond just my self-interest in the material world and its enjoyments and so forth. So that does not become lost. So now on that basis, I still want to pursue bhakti, but I can't identify like I could in the material world those markers I talked about. How long will it take for me to get the goal of this thing, love of God? Can anybody answer? Right? That becomes one. How long will it take? Oh, and again, I have to give up all considerations of my own self-interest. Also, I have no control. It's completely dependent on mercy. I can only perform the endeavor to appeal for that mercy. Wow, so I'm super vulnerable, and I don't even have a time frame of when this will be over. Even if a person is in prison for a crime, they get a sentence, and they could say, well, it's 20 years. Or even if it's life, you can reckon, I have life in prison. But in bhakti, there's not even a direct idea how long we'll be in this particular position. I'm talking about in the very beginning. Obviously, as you begin to mature, you begin to be able to see things more clearly. And those markers appear to you in the forms of realizing the steps of bhakti spoken about by Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. Ado Shraddha, Tata Sadhu Sangha, Bhajana Kriya, Anatanavritti, etc. Right? But in the beginning, that's not there. So the approach to bhakti now becomes sometimes enthusiastic based on what I've understood already, but sometimes, oh, this is not easy. So it becomes hot and cold. And when that happens, because we are still in a phase where that idea of being the doer is not completely erased from the consciousness. We have not completely gotten rid of that. It reemerges as the attempt to adjust bhakti in a way to make it more easily digestible for us. So we start to consider things. Well, maybe it would be a good idea because I've seen that within the temple, there is a category of people practicing. They're the ones who wear the orange and everything, or the saffron, if you're familiar truly, right? And they seem to have gotten a lot of this. So maybe I should just go ahead and do that. But on the other hand, I mean, I still have a desire to be married, or I am actually married. So what would happen to my wife or my children, especially if I have children? How will I make a living? So in this way, from that sense of doership, you start to contemplate so many options of how to adjust bhakti to make it more suitable to your position of vulnerability. And this is called Vyuda Vikalpa. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur identifies this stage as Vyuda Vikalpa. The tendency to try to examine how to adjust bhakti to make it more conquerable, so to speak. When that happens and you realize, as you, of course, were informed in the beginning, your doership won't have any true influence here. Everything is really about saranagati, meaning the complete surrender and the appeal for mercy. It creates a situation psychologically of, all right, I give up. I can't walk out the door of bhakti because there's too much of a resonance of understanding to just leave it alone, but really pursuing it seems difficult. What that does is open up the floodgate for all the previous material impressions to try to flood back in. That stage is called Vishaya Sagara. Sagara means ocean. Vishaya means material impressions or material enjoyment. Here in this case, impressions of material enjoyment. Suddenly there's this flood of old habits and things, and we're trying to deal with it, right? And it seems overwhelming. That's why Vishaya Sagara. Just like if you picture yourself in the middle of an ocean it's a hopeless condition in many ways, because you're thinking, what will happen? Still, in the bottom of your heart, there's some hope. A helicopter or a ship or something may pass. But it's a very tenuous time, because it seems like, what can I do? Again, I'm completely vulnerable, and I don't have any sense of doership here to change things. I tried that. That was Viudvikalpa. It did not work. Now I'm immersed in this position, Vishaya Sagara, of being overwhelmed by previous material impressions. So at that point, the practices that we were doing, right? Hearing, chanting, associating, by the thrust of that influence of material impressions, they become affected and they begin to wane slightly. This is called Niyamakshama. This is the fifth stage in the psychological sort of unfoldment, so to speak, or psychological adjustment period. So now it becomes harder to chant. Being harder to chant, especially during Brahma Muhurta hours, and especially with concentration and absorption, a sense of frustration comes in. I have to do it, it's a duty. So then I'll chant Hare Krishna, 1 round. Hare Krishna, okay, 2, how many rounds is that? Right? And because there's not a sense of synthesis between the heart and the sadhana, then the sadhana cannot truly reciprocate realizations with the aspirant, and therefore that distance due to niyamakshama, right, causes a further kind of mood of, I can't live with it and I can't live without it. Psychology in the aspirant. Then one realizes, listen, the only way this will be reconciled, only way this will be adjusted is by mercy. And this is the stage which is very helpful, because it's at this stage that one gives up the sense of hopelessness and places all the hope which should have been placed at the lotus feet of Shri Guru. Shri Guru is a representative of Bhagavan. Places all hope at the lotus feet of Shri Guru and Sadhu. And then by the natural compassion and karun shakti, means mercy of the sadhu, they open their hearts, and through their harikatha and their bhajan shiksha, they revive the enthusiasm and spiritual strength in that aspirant. Once that happens, then again the aspirant's practice becomes subsidized more significantly, and they begin to more deeply chant, hear harikatha, associate with sadhus, and in this way they develop spiritual strength. One last element though remains. As soon as this thrust of spiritual energy comes, and you see the waning now of the material influences, the last and most difficult element of Anushtita Bhakti raises its head. Pratishta asa drashta swapacharamani ridi menate katu katam sadhu prema spritachi suchihi nanu manaha. Sri Raghunath Das Goswami is identified in Manasiksha Granth, in the book Manasiksha. He's identified that even after conquering over the gross sense enjoyments and coming to the platform where one's spiritual strength is arising, the outcast prostitute of pride begins to dance in the heart. And the devotee begins to think, yes, I'm chanting very nicely. I'm having so many realizations. I'm memorizing so many shloks. My kirtan is impeccable. My sevas has been recognized by so many people. And in this way, that very subtle, because here you have to really digest the speaking of Sri Raghunath Das Goswami. The word drashta means audacious. So he's saying, obviously, if you were to see an outcast prostitute dancing in a public square, you would think, oh, that's very audacious, right? And if anybody's practicing any kind of dharma or spiritual life, oh, I will stay very far away from such things. So Raghunath Das Goswami's implication here is, how then did it manage to sneak into your heart? You understand? How did it sneak into your heart? Because in the form of the bhakti impressions given by Sri Guru and the subsidized power that came, now the subtle tendency to enjoy that has come as labdha puja pratishta, the desire for name, fame, etc., etc. And pride is of such a nature that it can be present and you cannot even recognize it. Therefore, there's an overemphasis given in Gaudiya practice to Trenadapi Sunichena. Always be very, very in a mood of Trenadapi Sunich, seeing oneself very fallen, very humble. Tarorapi Evasishnuna. Be very tolerant. Don't bring your ego into every situation. Amani Namanadena. Be ready to give all kinds of respect to others, but don't look any respect in return. Understand? This is the nature of how a person can chant real Nam, sincerely, continuously. Kirtaniya Sadahari. So, it's very important that in this last stage, which is called Tarangarangini, right? The waves of this pride, to submit, Raghunath Das Goswami says, submit that by calling out at the lotus feet of Sadhu Guru. Oh, Sadhu Guru, please save me from this. Like Bhaktivinoda Thakur singing in one bhajan. Tai Sisha Tava Takya Savara Guru Abhimana Tyaji. Because the deepest form of pride is Guru Abhiman. So he's saying, may that Guru Abhiman Tyaji go far away from me. Tai Sisha Tava Takya Savara. May always be immersed only in meditation that I am the Sishya and Sevak of my Guru Padapadma. This deep absorption in this mood is where the constant flow through Parampara of the Satam Prasanga Mamaviya Samvido Bhavantirit Karina Rasanayakata, the Rasakata and Rasayan, that tonic also, because Rasa is Rasayan until eligibility comes. What I mean by that is that, like in the third shlok of Srimad Bhagavatam, Falstuti verse of Bhagavatam, Pibata Bhagavatam Rasayam Alayam. Alayam here means until the person has become eligible to taste rasa. What is the eligibility for tasting ras? Vyatiti bhavana vatma yas chamatkara bharabuhu ridi satvale ujjale bhadam. When the heart is illuminated by Suddha Sattva, at that time bhadam, it can hold up the rasa samagri of bhakti. Prior to that, alayam, during the period of unfoldment, that same rasa will be rasayan, means like a tonic or medicine to heal the conditioned state of the consciousness of the jiva and bring them to the point of eligibility to taste rasa. Understand? So one should call out deeply at the lotus feet of Guru and Sadhu, save me from this pratishta asha, desire for name, fame, etc. So these 6 stages of Anushtita Bhakti are the basis under which much emotional, psychological adjustment and even apparent trauma goes on in an aspirant who's trying to practice bhakti. But if you can have this wonderful diagnosis given by Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur and the answers presented in the practice of Sadhan Bhajan, you'll see that there's a complete, encapsulated, absolute existence of everything needed to progress in bhakti without going outside the framework of the practice of Sudha Bhakti or Swarup or Siddha Bhakti. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur and Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu Bindu, and of course our Srila Rupa Goswami Pad in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu have outlined. Bhakti may be practiced in different ways. Swarup Siddhi Bhakti, Arop Siddhi Bhakti, and Sangha Siddhi Bhakti. Understand? So you need to understand the difference between these 3 things. I'm not going into detail here now. But Swarup Siddha Bhakti is our goal. Swarup Siddha Bhakti means practicing according to the actual Swarup of Bhakti. Shravan, Kirtan, Vishnu, Smaran, Padasevanam, etc. Having done Iti Pumsa, Prita Vishnu, Bhaktasthanavalak, having done Saranagati. This is the practice of Swarup Siddhi Bhakti. Sangha Siddhi Bhakti just briefly means following those things which are favorable to Bhakti, but not being absolutely and completely dependent on it. You understand? Because the core things are what is the practice of Bhakti. Arop Siddha Bhakti is the least desirable thing. It means when you still want to have some sense of self-control. So I like playing music, so I'll play songs about Krishna, and this way there's some compromise between my desire and the desire of Krishna. You understand? So it has some connection with bhakti, but arop means it's assigned to my self-interest as well. You understand? All right, so hopefully this was helpful. The idea was to present some understanding of the backdrop of the impact of psychological and emotional unfoldment while practicing bhakti, and the fact that within the framework of our Gaudiya theology, this has been addressed. And also the remedies for these things have been addressed. It's not that the remedies changed. Harinam, Harikatha, Sadhu Seva, all those things remain the same. Trying to become absorbed, all of these things, no need to change the medicine, but to change the perspective on the diagnosis to understand how the medicine works is what we wanted to try to accomplish here. So hopefully that was able to be accomplished. Right? To understand that the diagnosis given by our Acharya, like Srila Vishnu Chakravarti Thakur, gives emphasis to the efficacy of the medicine of hearing and chanting, serving, etc. Understand? All right, my Dandavat Pranam devotees, please pray for me. Always give me your mercy and blessings. I'm always in pursuit of that. Jaivancha Kalpaturubhisha Kripa Sindhuvevacha Patitanam Pavaneva Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jai Radhe Radhe.